These two choux were made from exactly same dough, but I changed one thing.
I prepared a choux pastry using a fairly classic recipe. I divided it into two different batches, and at the very end, I changed just one thing. The result might surprise you. But first, let's make the choux pastry. Milk and water into the saucepan, then add the sugar and salt. I always like to melt my butter separately, so now I add the melted butter as well. Meanwhile, I whisk the eggs together and place them over warm water. I want to bring them to somewhere between 35 and 40 degrees Celsius. I bring my liquid mixture to a boil and add all the flour at once. I chose a strong flour with a high gluten content. Now I start my timer. For exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds, I'm going to work the penne without turning the heat back on. The bottom of my saucepan is thick enough to hold and release plenty of heat. After 1 minute and 30 seconds, I'm done. I take my penne and transfer it into the bowl of my mixer. I fit the mixer with a pedal attachment and let it run on speed 1 to cool the penne down. My target temperature is somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees Celsius. Let's check the eggs. 37 degrees, so that's ideal. So let's see the penne. 46, 47 degrees, also exactly where I want it. So now we can start combining them. I turn the mixer back on at the lowest speed and gradually start adding the eggs. The emulsion between the eggs and the penne is one of the key parts of making choux pastry. There's absolutely no reason to rush. Add the eggs gradually and always give each addition enough time to properly incorporate before adding more. This batch isn't really ideal for the size of my mixer bowl, but that's okay. The mixer will eventually handle it, and I'm going to finish the dough by hand anyway. Once you feel that your dough is getting close to the final consistency, you really don't want to go too far and add too much eggs. It's always better to stop a little earlier and then adjust the consistency by hand. So take the bowl out of the mixer, grab a spatula, and start working the dough by hand. This is the kind of consistency we're looking for. As you can see, I still have some egg left, so you don't always need to use all of it. I chose a 9mm plain round tip, fit it into my piping bag, and transfer the dough into the bag. Because I'm going to pipe the dough by hand rather than putting it into silicone molds, I want to remove as much air from it as possible. So I flatten the bag like this and try to push out all the air bubbles. Air bubbles can create weak spots while piping, and later, during baking, those weak spots can become places where the choux starts to crack. So I'm trying to make sure that the inside the bag there is basically just dough with as few air pockets as possible. Then I use my scraper to push everything back towards the tip. And with the piping bag prepared like this, we can move on a step further. I said I was going to make two batches, so I have two perforated aluminum trays and two identical perforated silicone mats. To keep the experiment as objective as possible, I marked the same position on both trays using rings, so the choux will bake in the same positions in the oven. Now I pipe the dough as precisely and evenly as I can, trying to get the best and most consistent result as possible. I try to keep the piping pressure steady and pipe each portion in one continuous movement from directly above, so I get a nice, smooth portion of dough. Finally, I prepare a small bowl of cold water and smooth out any little imperfections that appeared during piping. Then I sprinkle them with cocoa butter, which helps keep the surface flexible as it melts during baking. And finally, I add some icing sugar, which helps set the surface and creates a very thin, almost invisible crust. And now we come to our one change. Both batches are ready. The first batch will start at 130 degrees Celsius, or about 265 Fahrenheit. The second batch will start at 180 degrees Celsius, or about 355 Fahrenheit. I deliberately chose two very different starting temperatures so we can clearly compare what they actually do to the dough. And the result, not only on the outside but especially on the inside, might surprise you. During baking, you can see how differently the choux expands at the two temperatures. At the beginning, the difference isn't that obvious, but later, it definitely is. At the lower temperature, the expansion is slower and the surface stays smoother and more even. At the higher temperature, the dough rises much faster and much more aggressively, and lots of small cracks begin to appear. The choux still hold their overall shape, but the surface becomes much more cracked and irregular. And at the end, we take two completely different products out of the oven. Here you can have a closer look. One is clearly more cracked, it expanded more, and it's also taller. The other stayed lower, but the surface is much smoother and more even. And when you put them directly next to each other, the difference becomes even more obvious. But what might really surprise you is what happened inside. Here you can see a beautiful large cavity, exactly the kind of structure we used to seeing in our choux pastry. And this is one of that started at the lower temperature. The choux that started at the higher temperature has lots of small cavities instead. Interestingly, I saw the same pattern in every choux I cut open from these batches. Here you can see them directly next to each other. So in this experiment, the starting temperature affected not only the surface, but also the internal structure of the choux pastry. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you again in another experiment. Have a great day. Bye.